This is Dr. Esther Legend. He's back. I want to talk about the events taking place in Minnesota regarding ICE, law enforcement in Minnesota and Minneapolis. Let's deal with some facts here. First of all, Minneapolis, Minnesota is not an autonomous zone. And what's taking place there, I want to make absolutely clear, this is an insurrection. Federal law supersedes state and local law. Federal law enforcement supersedes state and local law enforcement. We have something called the Constitution, and in the Constitution we have the concept of preemption. Federal law supersedes state and local law. Federal law enforcement can go anywhere in the United States they have authority. So basically, state officials, in my opinion, are acting as Confederates and segregationists as in the past. They are openly defying federal law and federal law enforcement. Now, what is ICE doing? Now, ICE has been around for a long time in various names and various forms, going all the way back to President Harry Truman. A lot of people don't know this. They think it's a new phenomenon. Deporting people. No, it goes all the way back. And what they're doing is they're simply removing people that have been convicted of crimes, been arrested of crimes, and are wanted in their country for criminal activity. We're only taking the criminals out. These are people that don't belong in the United States, that are subject to deportation. So, in any case, this is what's happening now. They're not taking little children out of elementary schools and knocking on doors and taking people out who are United States citizens. So let me make that absolutely clear. Again, the United States is a union of states. It is indivisible. And this is the idea that's been passed down and made clear by a gentleman by the name of Abraham Lincoln in the Civil War. He simply said that even though the southern states seceded from the Union was indivisible, and it was still a union, and what they did was illegal, and the southern states, their secession, they were insurrectionists. Again, Minnesota, Minneapolis, it's not an autonomous zone. It's a state. It's part of the United States and subject to federal law. So what's happening is that Minnesota officials, the mayor of Minneapolis, the governor, the attorney general, they are advocating that people harass ICE law enforcement. This is insurrectionist activity. You can't pick and choose what laws you're going to follow. Look, if you don't like the law, if you don't like what ICE is doing, then change the law. Don't engage in insurrection. Unfortunately, these people that are involved down in Minnesota, in my opinion, need deprogramming. They've been brainwashed to believe that they can impede federal law enforcement. Not only are they brainwashed, they're dry cleaned. Now, why Minnesota? Well, first of all, and Minneapolis. Well, first of all, we have, if you remember the whole George Floyd thing. So there's a history there. And the history there was basically from one police officer that all police are bad. All law enforcement is bad. And they have to be stopped. And they have to be defunded. So, in my opinion, what has happened is Minnesota officials, the Minneapolis people, they got emboldened after the George Floyd riots. And they went on this escapade of defunding the police and making all law enforcement, making them illegal. You can't pick and choose. And what's happened again is these state officials have told people, go out basically and stop ICE. ICE is not wanted. Now, could this be a diversion from the whole problem of the Somali fraud that has taken place in Minnesota, particularly Minneapolis? It's estimated somewhere up to $9 billion has been defrauded of state and federal taxpayers. I think Donald Trump has been reluctant to invoke the Insurrection Act. And I'm going to go through the various insurrections that have occurred in the United States. He's said he might invoke the Insurrection Act. I will tell you go through what insurrection is. But we're just talking about obstruction of the ICE officials by local individuals who are egged on by the state officials. This is the same thing that was done by the Confederates, disobeying federal law in the past, and the segregationists in the South. I went through this. I remember the period. And ultimately, the federal government wins out because under the Constitution, federal law supersedes state and local law, and federal officials supersede state and local officials. The southern states were not successful in leaving the Union. We fought a civil war. The segregationists were not effective in stopping integration in the South. We also have what is known as federal law, federal statute, 8 U.S.C. 1357A1. Federal law enforcement, the ICE people, they're allowed to go all through the United States, and if they find people that aren't here, they can deport them. You cannot impede them. If you impede them, you're violating federal statute. Not only that, we had a recent Supreme Court case, Nome v. Perdomo, September 8, 2025, which said that these federal law enforcement, the ICE individuals, can question people about their citizenship status. This again is under the federal statute. You would think that this is the first time this has ever happened. The first time that federal law enforcement has gone through the United States and deported people that did not belong here. Who gets deported? People that have come here illegally. If they're illegally here, federal law says they can be deported. President Clinton deported 869,000 people. President Bush the Younger, over 2 million people. And lo and behold, President Obama, over 3 million people. And those three presidents, there were no demonstrations. No one objected to what they were doing. And federal law enforcement just simply deported people that didn't belong here. During Trump's first administration, 551,000. Even during the Biden administration, 588,000 deported. Currently, in the first year of the Trump administration, another 600,000 people. So if we do the math, we see that in 5 years, Trump has deported about 1,100,000 people. But in 8 years, President Obama had 3 million people deported. Now, this doesn't count under President Trump's current administration of those people that have self-deported. Voluntarily, 1.9 million have just simply, they're here illegally, and they just left on their own. They've self-deported, so we're not counting those numbers. So there's a history of this. Again, the federal government is superior to state and local government and their laws and their law enforcement. This is a union. We are a union of states, indivisible, the federal system. This has occurred before. We had what was called the nullification crisis of 1832. This is where the state of the state of South Carolina would not pay or collect the tariff of 1832. So as a result, President Andrew Jackson said that South Carolina was in a state of insurrection. So he got Congress to pass what was called the Force Act of 1833, because South Carolina actually passed a law, the Ordinance of Nullification. And President Jackson said, hey, you can't do this. We're going to send in the military. You're an insurrection. And South Carolina backed off. The end result was President Jackson gave a speech on May 1st, 1833. I'm quoting him. The tariff was only a pretext, and disunion and Southern Confederacy the real object. The next pretext will be the Negro or slavery question. In other words, back in 1833, President Jackson was predicting that the Southern states were going to form a confederacy. They were going to be engaged in insurrection. He foresaw it. And then it was going to be over the slavery issue. And lo and behold, it happened. The Civil War, April 12, 1861. The South Carolina militia fired on federal Fort Sumter. They were an insurrection. And they seceded, or they said that they were leaving the Union, and other states left the Union. Of course, President Lincoln said, you're really can't leave the Union because you're an insurrection and the Union is indivisible. Lincoln said in his first inaugural address, acts of violence against the authority of the U.S. are insurrectionary or revolutionary, and the purpose of the Constitution is to form a more perfect union. He gave this on his inaugural address, March 4th, 1861. So here we see two perfect examples of insurrection. The nullification crisis of 1832 and the Civil War. I thought that the issue of insurrection and nullification has already been decided by the Civil War, but lo and behold, the people in Minnesota are revisiting it again. Then we have insurrection in more modern times. September 1957, Little Rock, Arkansas. Central High School was under a court order to desegregate. And the local officials in Little Rock wanted to desegregate Central High School based upon the Supreme Court decision of Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. The governor, Orville Faubus, activated the National Guard to block the entrance of black students from entering Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. President Eisenhower did not like what the Governor Faubus did. He called him on the phone. He said, you got to back off, get rid of the National Guard and let the students attend the high school because that's the federal law. Federal law of desegregation. Well, Governor Faubus did not want to back off. So President Eisenhower invoked the Insurrection Act on September 23rd, 1957. He said that Arkansas was in a state of insurrection. And what he did was he sent in the 82nd Airborne, the military, and they escorted the students into Central High School. Then we had President Kennedy invoking the Insurrection Act 3 times. September 30th, 1962, University of Mississippi riot against racial integration. June 11th, 1963, Alabama was interfering with insurrection, and he used federal troops. And he used federal troops in the first instance. And on September 10th, 1963, he declared another insurrection, and he federalized the Alabama National Guard to integrate Alabama schools and public universities. 3 times President Kennedy invoked the Insurrection Act. And then President Reagan invoked the Insurrection Act when there was simply a prison riot that occurred in the United States. So let's go through the specific events of what took place with the death of the driver in Minneapolis. And I'm a lawyer, so I'm familiar with how the law works in situations like this. First of all, she was not peacefully demonstrating. Number two, she was not a pedestrian. She was in her car. She was stopped in the highway, perpendicular to traffic, and blocking traffic. This is a felony. I call it felony number one. She was blocking law enforcement vehicles. This is felony number two. You can't do that. Then we see, looking at the video, or a number of videos, that her partner exits the vehicle and starts filming the situation. Several officers try to detain the driver of the vehicle, but fail. The driver puts the car in reverse. A lot of people don't see this. She puts the car in reverse. Now the car is moving. This is very important. Once a vehicle is moving, it can be perceived as a deadly weapon. Always under the law. 2,000, 3,000 pounds of a deadly weapon. Then she points the car in the direction. She goes left slightly. There was a officer who was on her driver's side, and now since her vehicle is now pointed to the left, he is now in front of her vehicle, and the vehicle is coming to him. You have this happens very quickly. In order to protect himself from a moving vehicle that is now a deadly weapon, he shoots the driver through the front window. The law, moving vehicles can be a deadly weapon, both to officers on foot and pedestrians, and even officers in their vehicles. And they can use deadly force to stop a vehicle. By the way, you don't shoot out the tires. People can drive on flat tires. They can even drive on rims. The object is to stop the vehicle, not necessarily to kill the driver, but to stop the vehicle, because once the vehicle is moving, it can be considered a deadly weapon. And nobody knows what will happen afterwards if you just simply shoot out the tire. So we can see a course of conduct. The driver of the vehicle has already committed 2 felonies by blocking the highway, by impeding law enforcement by the use of their vehicles, and I perceive this as a 3rd felony. This is a course of conduct. And I think she thought she was, well, it's hard to say what she was thinking. But certainly the officials in Minnesota have stirred up people, go out and block ICE. We don't want ICE here. So you have people that are cannon fodders or useful idiots. The useful idiot syndrome. They're being brainwashed, dry cleaned, following orders. They perceive that what they're doing is correct, and it's not. I'll give you a personal situation. I was teaching in a local university a number of years ago. A student of mine, this was in 2017. You can go on the internet and look this one up. It's there. She went to South Beach in Miami Beach, Florida. She was in her vehicle. She hit a number of parked cars, and then her car stopped. Now, if you know anything about South Beach, there are a lot of police on foot patrol. So 2 police officers approached her vehicle, and then she proceeded to move the vehicle as the driver and hit one of the officers. I mean, really hit him. So what the second officer did was, he was on the side of the vehicle, he shot her and killed her. And this is what can happen. A vehicle can be a dangerous weapon. The law says if an officer perceives a moving vehicle, if he perceives that he is in danger, that he is going to suffer significant bodily harm, or one of his compatriots, one of his mates, is going to receive serious bodily harm or has received serious bodily harm, he can use deadly force to stop the vehicle. Because there's no telling what would have happened if the vehicle continued. We see as a course of conduct, she hit a number of parked cars. She was out of control. We don't know why. I didn't see the autopsy report, but supposedly she was under the influence of something or other. And it was not a problem. Police acted accordingly. There's another story I'm familiar with. This is more a local story where there was a robbery at the bank. The suspect was fleeing in his vehicle, and the police set up a roadblock. And the officers were behind their vehicles in a roadblock, and the driver then accelerated toward the roadblock. He didn't stop. He wanted to go faster. So the police used deadly force because they were in fear of serious bodily harm, or who knows what would have happened. Again, going back to Minnesota or Minneapolis, the mayor and the governor, they are telling people to stop ICE. ICE isn't wanted here. They are possibly advocating insurrection. The interesting thing is they themselves are not at the scene of any of these things that are going on. They're back somewhere else doing the advocating. Again, federal law enforcement can legally round up people that are illegally here anywhere in the United States. They're doing it in most of the states. Done by previous administrations, all the way back to President Truman and President Eisenhower. President Truman and President Eisenhower deported 5 million people. State officials in Minnesota are encouraging civilians to violate the law by impeding federal law enforcement. These officials and others that are advocating insurrection, they're not doing anything themselves. I compare them, I'll give a Civil War analogy, I'm comparing them to General Pickett, a Confederate. If you remember anything from the Civil War, we had something called Pickett's Charge. This was the Battle of Gettysburg. Thousands of Confederate troops marched uphill to take, I think it was Cemetery Ridge at Gettysburg. General Pickett ordered them, and they got slaughtered at Pickett's Charge. General Pickett was in the back. He didn't charge. Eventually, when the Civil War was over, General Pickett lived a nice long life. So I'm comparing this to what's going on in Minneapolis and Minnesota. The people that are advocating insurrection, they're not there out on the street. They're not there with the useful idiots or the people that have been brainwashed. Most of the people, most of the states and local governments are cooperating with ICE and handing over illegal people that are in the United States. It's only in a few places where we've seen obstruction and insurrection. Los Angeles, Chicago, and now Minneapolis. Almost all of the people that have been deported under the Trump administration for the last year are people that here, they're all here illegally, and almost all of them are criminals. They've either engaged in criminal conduct, they've been either arrested and convicted and let go, or they've been arrested, or they're wanted in their countries. I have no rational explanation why anybody would want to impede federal officials for simply sending people back to the country where they belong, particularly where they're engaged in criminal behavior. Maybe it has to do with money. Who knows? Why are they doing this? One theory, Well, you have all these other deportations by other presidents and nobody said anything. Another theory is, well, it's Trump. It's because the Trump administration is doing this. If Donald Trump brushes his teeth the wrong way, people will protest because it's Trump. So again, or maybe they want to get votes. What's going on presently in Minnesota is insurrection. No different than the Southern secessionists, than the Southern segregationists. Absolutely the same. 3 million people were deported. More than 3 million were deported by Barack Obama during his presidency, and nobody blinked. There was no demonstrations, no protests. Many more than under President Trump's first administration and second administration. Doesn't make any sense. The law. Crossing the border illegally is a federal criminal offense. First time illegal crossing is a misdemeanor. 8 U.S.C. 1325. Now, an illegal entry after deportation, you've been deported and you're coming back illegally, that's a felony. 8 U.S.C. 1326. Overstaying a visa, student visa, work visa, tourist visa, if you overstay, you're subject to deportation. That is a misdemeanor. I'm going to conclude by quoting President Obama while he was a United States Senator. We simply cannot allow people to pour into the United States undetected, undocumented, unchecked, and circumventing the line of people who are waiting patiently, diligently, and lawfully to become immigrants in this country. Again, President Obama in his administration, he deported many more people than Donald Trump has deported. And what's the logic here? Is this just simply all about Trump? Nobody said anything. Nobody said anything when any of those other presidents deported millions of people. Now all of a sudden, there's massive protests, at least in a few areas. All right, so I want to conclude and mention that this is my podcast, Conversation with Dr. S. the Legend. That's who I am. And I can be reached through my email. There's the old email. If you want to contact me and have a comment. And then as you can see, these beautiful rodeo and Western pictures and paintings, they can be all viewed at this website. Enjoy Western art, rodeos, cowboys. It's Americana. Now this is Dr. S. the Legend, signing off.